I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we do a deep dive on tanks, discuss Biden's speech in Warsaw, and we interview the UK Shadow Secretary for Defence, Labour MP John Healy.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 22nd of February, day 364. And joining me today are Associate Editor Dominic Nicholls, Weekend Foreign Editor Venetia Rainey, Foreign Correspondent Colin Freeman, Defence Editor Danny Sheridan, and our guest is John Healy, Labour's Shadow Secretary for Defence. I started by asking Venetia for the latest updates from Ukraine and around the world.
So I'm going to start us off in Russia, in Moscow to be precise, because we have got a massive rally underway that Putin is expected to speak at later today. We don't know if it's specifically to mark the one-year anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine, but the timing is obviously fairly suspicious. The actual anniversary is on Friday. Putin isn't there yet. A massive nationalist rally of the kind that we saw last year with lots of performers in various traditional dress from across Russia, a band of accordion players with Z caps, incredibly colourful, lots of fireworks, thousands of people waving Russian flags. So a real sort of moment of nationalist fervour in Russia. And we're waiting to see what Putin is going to say, but he'll be probably pressing the same lines around no regret of the Ukraine invasion, Russia will win, etc., etc. Where Putin is at the moment is he's been meeting with China's top diplomat, Wang Yi. Wang Yi was in Russia yesterday. He met with Sergei Lavrov. He's been doing the rounds, consolidating the Russian-Chinese relationship. We've had lots of comments from both sides saying that the relationship is reaching new heights, that cooperation is better than ever, that trade will increase this year, and that the relationship is one that can stabilise the world. That's what Putin said today. Quite a lot of bluster, but obviously this is a key geopolitical relationship to keep an eye on, one that we've seen certainly growing closer over the past year. Despite the complexities of China, for China about the Ukraine war and the sort of difficult position that it potentially put it in, China has not ever come out and explicitly condemned Russia. It's almost certainly working with it on providing arms and other sort of technical support. And that personal relationship, as we can see, is continuing to grow closer. We are expecting Xi Jinping to visit Russia at some point this year. Vladimir Putin alluded to that when he said he's looking forward to meeting Xi. Some other bits to flag, a bit more Ukraine-based. We heard a report today that Russia tried and failed to launch an intercontinental ballistic missile on Monday while Biden was in Ukraine. And this is its Satan II missile. That's the nickname that the West give to the Samamat missile system. It did successfully test launch it last year. It's a nuclear-capable missile, but it apparently failed on Monday, which is quite amusing. And one other story to quickly flag is that Wagner Group's chief, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has been at it again, talking about the lack of ammo that his group are facing. Wagner, you'll remember, are fighting on the front line in Bakhmut and other areas of eastern Ukraine. They're pretty much Russia's best hope for frontline gains at the moment. They seem to be, leading the charge the most anyway. We did see a post last week. This might feel like a familiar story to some listeners. We saw a post last week from the Wagner Group in general. They posted a quite gruesome picture of a room filled with dead bodies. And Prigozhin later spoke about the lack of ammo. But he's posted another picture and specifically commented on it, saying all these people died from ammunition hunger, he called it. Ammo shortages have been a problem for both the Ukrainians and the Russians. Obviously, the Ukrainians are relying on the West to bolster their supplies of both bullets, shells, all kinds of ammo. But Russia doesn't have that many other partners to rely on and is having to sort of amp up its own industrial capabilities. And the Wagner Group has been very, very vocal. Prigozhin's been incredibly vocal about the lack of ammo that his group are facing and how it's causing lots of high casualty rate in Russia.
Well, thank you very much, Venetia. You've touched on a lot of things there. Could we just ask you to go into a little more detail about Biden's speech, President Joe Biden's speech in Poland yesterday? This actually happened after the podcast we recorded, so we didn't get a chance to speak about it, but it was huge news yesterday afternoon and evening. Can you talk us through what he said and what that might mean for the war?
Yeah, so Biden obviously was in Ukraine on Monday and then went to Warsaw, which was a more scheduled stop that we did know about after a surprise visit to Kyiv. It was a really massive speech, and he was sort of continuing the rock star theme that we saw on Monday, very confident, very assertive. The best line from the speech, which is what we ended up doing a massive story on, was Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia, never. But lots of good quotes from his speech talking about there should be no doubt our support for Ukraine will never waver, NATO will not be divided, and we will not tire. Kyiv stands strong, Kyiv stands proud. There is no sweeter word than freedom. You know, this was really Biden in full force, showing Putin that the West is united on this war and it's not going to tire of it anytime soon, and that we will continue to support Kyiv in its battle to not be overtaken by Russia. And it's significant. This is obviously a week where we're seeing world leaders really come out and make their positions known on this sort of key week of the anniversary. Putin with his massive rally, Biden with his surprise visit to Ukraine, and they're setting out their stalls. You know, they're saying no regrets, and we're going to keep going harder and stronger. And I think that tells you a lot about the direction that this war is going to go, and that it's not going away anytime soon.
Well, thank you very much, Venetia, for that. Welcome, Colin. We can see you're on as a speaker. Just before bringing in Colin, who I believe is in Kyiv at the moment, Dom Nicholls, I know you have a few updates for us. Can you talk us through them?
Yeah, hi David, hi everybody, hi Colin. So the update from the ground in Ukraine, the only one to refocus on today is that something big went bang last night in Mariupol, or the early hours of this morning in Mariupol, been held by Russia for months now, the scene of the Azovstal steel plant, that stout defence there. But something hit an ammo dump last night, and it's made a very big bang on social media. Now, it's a long way away from any lines where Ukraine would be able to position something, and we're wondering, there's speculation whether or not this is the first evidence of the ground-launched small diameter bombs, a very long range and very accurate weapon that we know has been sent to Ukraine. It's GPS guided, about 80 kilometers range, so it could hit Mariupol if it was right on the edge of the where the fighting is at the moment, which would be a risk for Ukraine to put a highly prized asset like that so close to the front line. But if they are willing to do it, and we've seen them take great risk before, then, and of course if this is what we think it might be, then it shows that actually they've got great reach here, and so it's one to watch. There maybe will be more of that, but I thought that was very interesting. I also just want to bring up to speed with a couple of things. I was in a brief yesterday with a Western official, as we said before, senior person or persons in the defence and security establishment, but I won't divulge who, where, or well, I told you the when. It was yesterday. But just a few bits and pieces from that I think we're particularly interested. Casualties we've spoken about as we can, when we can. It's very unclear about numbers on either side. And it is important. It's not just sort of ghoulish speculation. Of course, it is important to understand what the reality is on the ground. So what we think, this came from a Western official, and they've suggested that Russia is suffering about 1,000 casualties a day. Now, the recent figures, we were surprised a couple of weeks ago when the figures of sort of 800 a day were being produced. So that is just incredible, and had to sort of check it. And yes, that was the number being put out by Ukraine and then elsewhere. So Western official yesterday told me about 1,000 casualties a day. That's killed, wounded, missing, and taken prisoner. But 1,000 people off the battlefield. That is an enormous amount, an enormous number of people. Now, on the Ukrainian side, the official said Ukrainian casualties were, quote, on a level that would be unsustainable for many countries, unquote, and a figure of at least 100,000. Again, dead, wounded, missing, captured. A huge number, but the about half what we think Russia has suffered. But more importantly than that, I think the dead to wounded ratio is significantly lower for Ukraine than Russia. Now, if you're defending, you generally take fewer casualties than if you're attacking. Attacking is a very risky business, and defensive positions can be extremely hard to crack. So the defender generally has fewer casualties. But even so, the Russian casualties are thought to be 10 or 20 to 1, as in 10 or 20 wounded for one dead, as opposed to Ukraine sorry, I've got this completely around the wrong way. Ukraine is thought to be 3 to 1. I've got my numbers all completely mixed up here.
Shall we, Dom, while you read these numbers again, should we go to Colin? Because I know he's in Ukraine and might not be able to stay for very long.
Yeah, I'll take my socks off.
All right, thanks, Dom. Colin, I don't know if you can hear us. If you can, would you like to tell us where you are roughly and what stories you've been looking at?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just in transit at the moment in a minibus. Yes, maybe I can just add in on what Don was talking about there. My understanding is that the Ukrainian figures are around 100,000 casualties, but with a kind of mortality ratio of between 1 in 10 and 1 in 20, which means that only between 1 in only between 1 in 20 and 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 of those people are actually dying. So I think if you extrapolate that out over 100,000, that would mean a total death rate of possibly about between 5 and 10,000, which is a lot less than the Russian ratio, which is closer to 3 to 1, and also a lot less than some of the figures we've otherwise seen bandied around for Ukrainian total deaths, which in some cases people have been speculating that it may be roughly comparable to what the levels that the Russians have suffered, which according to some estimates are anything up to about 60,000 or so. I hope that perhaps sort of sheds a bit of light on it. That's certainly my tuppence worth on it.
So, Colin, where have you been and who have you been talking to?
Well, I'm in Kiev at the moment. We've been here for about 5 or 6 days, just doing a bit of general reporting. One of the stories we've been looking at, which we will be filing in the next couple of days, is a sort of year-on look at recruitment and asking the question, really, does Ukraine have enough soldiers or manpower or people power, given this is a unisex army? Does it have enough people power for the job? Obviously, we saw at the beginning of this time last year lots of Ukrainians volunteering for the fight, people who had, in many cases, never picked up a gun before, and that effectively sort of doubled their fighting force from sort of, something like 200,000 people to around 400,000 people. So what we're really trying to do is just get a sense of whether they need more volunteers for the fight, given the fairly high levels of attrition that we've just been talking about. And we've been looking at recruitment campaigns and so on and so forth. And so just trying to get a fix on how things are going in that sense.
And did you reach any conclusions there, or are you still looking into it?
Well, one of the things that they certainly are looking for new volunteers. One of the main units here, the National Guard, which has about 100,000 soldiers in it. They normally do sort of like a gendarmerie arrangement. That's what they're kind of comparable to during peacetime, but during wartime they actually get involved as regular soldiers. They have just launched a new recruitment campaign this month, for which they've had about, I think, between 20 and 40,000 people applying. So that does suggest that there are quite a lot of people who are still willing to fight. In many cases, those are people who for personal circumstances, haven't got round to fighting yet, rather than people who've suddenly gone through some massive change of heart. But it does suggest that there is still some gas left in the tank here in that sense.
That's fascinating. Earlier, Venetia Rainey talked to us about President Biden's speech in Warsaw, but you've been writing about his trip to Kyiv and how he came in on the train and all of that. What did you make of it? What did you discover?
Well, yes, I was actually in the main Kiev government press center at the time of Mr. Biden's arrival. It gives you a sense of the levels of secrecy that were surrounded the visit, in that nobody in the press center had the slightest clue what was going on, nor indeed did we. We suddenly noticed that there was a lot of traffic jams in the downtown area, which are not common at the moment, because there's not that many people living in the city at present. And at first we thought it was a visiting delegation of Israeli politicians who do tend to travel around with quite high security whenever they go abroad. We thought that it was them who had brought the city to a halt. It then became clear that this was no mere foreign delegation, or no run-of-the-mill foreign delegation. This was something rather more important. And I think we found out it was President Biden within about half an hour of the traffic coming to a standstill. And then by that time, though, he had already gone. What he did was he turned up at St. Michael's Cathedral, which is one of the main churches in the city centre, and laid some flowers at War Memorial along with President Zelensky. I think by the time myself and most other people in Kiev learned about it, though, he'd already disappeared off the streets again. It was a very, very brief walkabout, and gave a kind of brief press conference to a few travelling White House press reporters who were with him. Again, all kind of behind closed doors, and then he was off again. I think the trip was 3 hours in total. Interestingly, it was he did not come in on Air Force One, which is his normal mode of transport, nor did he use the Beast, which is his big armoured limousine, which he often travels around in as well. Instead, he came in, like many other world leaders have done, on the train, which is currently considered to be really the only safe way for foreign dignitaries to visit Ukraine. This being because the airspace above Ukraine is not fully controlled by the Ukrainian military. It's contested airspace, you could describe it as. And for a US president, that's relatively unusual to be traveling anywhere where the airspace is not controlled by the US or one of its allies, or where the president is not arriving with the express permission, with the tacit consent of whoever's controlling that airspace. So that was the essence of the trip. It was all conducted under complete secrecy, though, and apparently was several weeks in the planning, even senior White House staff not being aware of it. Although for the average Kiev resident, I think the only thing they saw was a few large traffic jams downtown, and then a few quick images on their TVs.
Thanks, Colin. And can I ask, before we go back to Dom Nicholls, you've been in Kyiv now for, I think it's about coming up to a week. You're back there. What's your sense of the mood, the atmosphere ahead of this Friday?
So I've been here a few times in the last year since the war started. Certainly things are obviously a lot more relaxed than they were this time last year, when it really did feel like World War III was breaking out. There was a sense of fear on the streets, etc., etc. I would say now, certainly people do remain convinced that the war is going their way, but there's definitely a sense of fatigue coming in. It doesn't mean to say that morale is dropping, but I don't think the anniversary is going to be a time for a great deal of celebration per se. I always temper these sorts of comments by saying, people present a certain face to the Western media, I suspect, and they don't want to give the impression that everybody's completely fed up and can't bear to face another year of war. But I think definitely this is a point where, just sort of the boost that everybody got at the beginning when it turned out that they could fight the Russians and keep them at bay, and that this was not the invincible army that everybody said it was. I think that euphoria is clearly probably running a bit low now, and it's just become a new normal, which a lot of people are kind of finding quite hard to cope with. But that doesn't mean to say they won't cope.
Well, thank you very much, Colin. It's really good to hear from you, and do stay safe while you're out there. Tom, can I come back to you? You've got a few more important updates for us to digest.
Yeah, sure. I've taken a deep breath. I'm ready to go back into battle with the numbers. But essentially what we were talking about there with the casualties is that Russia are having a far higher casualty rate in terms of people killed. And they're putting that down. Western officials are putting that down. Oh, Colin, I think you're still on. You need to mute yourself, mate, as you're clambering out of the van. Western officials saying that the Russian medical chain is just woefully inadequate. So if you are injured in the Russian army at the moment in Ukraine, you are far more likely to die than if you were injured in the Ukrainian army. So much higher casualty rate with the Russians, down to a poor medical chain. Now, it's thought to be, it's woolly, of course, but Western officials thinking there could be up to 300,000 Russian troops in Ukraine. And they're saying that at least half the mobilised force, which they think was in the hundreds of thousands, at least 200,000, at least half that mobilised force was immediately sent to Ukraine. And we think that may well account for the huge casualties we've seen in the last few weeks, because they are untrained, poorly equipped, poorly led, and they are just, we've heard the expression human wave around Bakhmut in that area. They are not being employed correctly, and they are paying a horrific price for it. Now, the rest of the mobilised force, which could be about 100, 150,000 people, that is said to be either in Russia or in Belarus training, but is being held as an operational reserve. Now, they've either had no training or absolutely minimal training. And that means, effectively, there is no reserve. Now, you've got to have, if you are an attacking force or a defending force, you've got to have a reserve. You need a reserve to exploit success or to plug a sudden hole that appears when the enemy breaks through, or, we all need a little fudge factor. We all need something in our back pocket to chuck at a problem or an opportunity as they appear. That's your operational reserve at every level. So, a company of 100 fighters should have a small reserve of maybe, a section of eight people or something like that. A battalion of 500 should have a reserve of a platoon of 30. A brigade, a division. There should always be, the commander at any level should always be able to reach out and grab a reserve to, as I say, chuck at a problem or an opportunity. So if Russia does not have an operational reserve, or it consists of extremely poorly trained, newly mobilised soldiers, they are not going anywhere fast, and they could very easily go backwards if they are hit with a credible punch from Ukraine. So I thought that was quite interesting, and that may account for why we're seeing so little happening in the Donbass. The lines aren't moving much. There's not a huge amount of success there for them to reinforce, but equally they just haven't got the forces to do it. So moving on. This figure, Ben Wallace used the figure of 97% of the Russian army was deployed in Ukraine. He said that a couple of weeks ago, and it caused all sorts of confusion because, that's a hell of a big number, 97%. So that was asked of Western official, and the answer came back that the 97% deployed meant that 97% of units in the Russian army have supplied something for the war. So either personnel, equipment, or they've provided training. So it's not 97% of the entire army in Ukraine, but it's a whole, almost a whole of force effort in some capacity. And then just finally, there are, as of yesterday, no signs that China is preparing to supply lethal aid. This was a comment that came out of Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the Munich Security Conference at the weekend, said that would be extremely serious if China sort of cross that Rubicon, but no suggestion China is preparing to supply lethal aid or has shown any interest in sustaining the war. So China at the moment is giving diplomatic cover, if you like. That we don't know of any material or humanitarian support for Russia, but at the moment, no suggestion they're doing anything more than that. The last point I want to make, and it came from the Munich Security Conference last weekend, there are discussions ongoing about a tank coalition to support Ukraine. This is sort of Leopard tanks. I mean, the Americans said they'll send Abrams. Britain said we'll send Challenger 2. But Leopard is the name of the game. German produced Leopard in widespread service around Europe and the world. So there are many more Leopard variants out there. So Finland's Defence Minister Mikko Savola, he said that this idea of a tank coalition had moved on. Said there'd been intense talks between Germany and Poland, and that Finland's participation in this Leopard initiative will be finalised in the next few days. These are the next few days. So hopefully we'll hear something soon. So what's happening here? So Germany and Poland are leading this emerging idea of a Leopard coalition. They've expressed an aim to quickly establish 2 Ukrainian tank battalions with 31 Leopard 2 tanks each. Now, Germany and Poland have promised 14 tanks. Canada has promised 4, Poland 3, and Spain today I'm looking at breaking news here. Spain has said they are going to supply 6 Leopard 2A4s there. Margarita Robles, the Defence Minister of Spain, said we are repairing right now 6 Leopard 2A4 vehicles with the possibility, if needed and if our allies request it, of increasing that number. And she said the tanks would be ready by late March, early April. So this is, it's moving in the right direction. And Finland's Defence Minister Mikko Savola said that Finland would be able to supply both battalions. The idea is that one battalion would be the older 2A4 version. That's the most widespread version around the world. 1990s vintage first came in. And the other battalion would be the 2A6, so a more modern version, built in the last 20-odd years. It's got a slightly different gun, different turret armour. They're both 120mm smoothbore main armament, but there are a few bits and pieces, and the 2A6 is just a newer variant. Now, the European Council on Foreign Relations, a think tank, said that there is they put out an article recently saying there's a reason to suspect that some earlier proclamations of willingness about tanks were made only to pile pressure on the Germans, unquote. And that's an interesting point, because a lot of people made good noises about supplying tanks, and now when it comes to actually putting numbers on that, we're still waiting for numbers. As I said, Canada, Portugal, Germany, Poland, Spain have actually put numbers on their pledges, and we're waiting for and hoping for others. But this is a long game, right? Tank production is a long game. The Leopard production line at the moment is basically being kept alive by an order from Hungary for 44 tanks, and it's highly likely that Norway is going to put a bid for at least 50 of the new 2A7 version, the most modern version. Czech Republic is also thinking that is looking likely to buy the 2A7. Germany are trying to upgrade their fleet to 2A7. They've already got 2A7 in service, and they had earmarked 68 of the older 2A4s and 16 2A6s to be modernised for 2A7. But it now looks like that's going to be too costly, so there may be those tanks might be up for grabs. But the point is that this is a big undertaking. The maintenance of these things. Where are you going to do all that? Is it going to be in Ukraine? Well, I mean, there will be certain elements of that, but also it needs to be outside Ukraine as well, but possibly outside with a view to moving inside the country after the war as part of a long-term security guarantee. But Germany needs long promises. If you buy a tank, you're talking 20 years minimum to have it in service. So these are big political decisions, and we're not everyone. When do you press print? We're not quite at hover tanks yet, but people are saying, tanks are going to be obsolete in 5 years' time, or you've got to do this, got to do that. So it's a big political call to say, right, we are going to invest in these things, and we're going to have them in for 20-odd years. We'll upgrade the armour, we'll upgrade the sights and the weapons maybe, but essentially the tank hull's going to be the same. That's the argument with Britain's Challenger 2 programme being upgraded to Challenger 3. Might be a new turret, but the hull, when they go out of service, the hull will be about 60 years old. So, this is a big a long-term commitment. And where's that money going to come from? You can't expect Germany to handle all that. Do you then look to the EU to produce these factories all across Europe, sort of generating Leopard 2 production lines so that Ukraine has a long-term security guarantee? Does it come from the jointly chaired UK-Dutch International Fund for Ukraine that we've mentioned a number of times, some of the meetings I've been to. So there are big decisions to be taken here, but it looks as if there is the emerging, or there will be 2 tank battalions for Ukraine in short order, and there are ideas being bandied around now and worked on about what a long-term tank solution might look like. But if it's going to be around the Leopard, then Germany needs more orders for the 2A7, the new 2A7 version, to make it worthwhile to set these things up again in order to support, or from which Ukraine will be supported over the longer term.
So, Dom, just to be clear, you reported that the European think tank had sort of said, well, this is what it sounded like to my ears, that countries had said that they were willing to supply Ukraine with tanks in order to put pressure on the Germans, but they hadn't sort of checked whether they could send it. So when the Germans finally did turn around and say, well, we can, all right, then who else is in? They had to sort of double back and make sure they could. Is that roughly right?
Yeah, it sounds as if there were a couple of things happening here. There was the political pressure on Germany to say yes, that they would export their own Leopard 2s, and as the producer, that they would give export permissions for those other countries, 14 countries in Europe, others around the world that use Leopard 2. They would have to give permission for them to be gifted as well. So there was great need for political pressure to be applied to Germany. At the same time, Germany seemed to be looking to the US for leadership here. Tanks were the latest in the is it provocative, is it escalatory kind of debate after air defence and HIMARS and all the rest of it. And that was why we think that the Biden administration eventually said, yeah, OK, we'll send 31 Abrams tanks. I mean, completely different type of vehicle, a different supply and logistic chain, quite a needy vehicle, very capable. I mean, immensely capable, but quite a needy quite a needy big beast. Same with Challenger 2. But it looked as if Germany was then waiting for America to take the first step, which they did. Germany then said, OK, we are prepared to send them and we will give the export licenses. And at that point, it seems as if the two parts, the politics and the actual art of the military industrial what is possible, had kind of not gone in lockstep. So when the countries said, right, brilliant, we've got the permissions, what have we got, what can we send? They look around and turns out that a lot of them are quite old, cranky, need refurbishment, need repairing, etc., etc. I mean, it's interesting that Spain are saying they're going to send 6. They said today they're going to send 6 2A4s, the older version, but after they've been refurbed and repaired. And they said March, April, which isn't a huge amount of time, but let's wait and see. So I think those countries who were looking to Germany to take the lead had allowed the two bits to get out of kilter, and we're now looking to those other countries. And Germany will be front and centre here, eyeballing these people, saying, right, you fellas, you've now got to put your tanks where your mouth is, kind of thing. So it will be interesting to see what happens in the next few days. But I would expect to see other Leopard operating countries step up and offer something here.
Thanks, Dom. 2 things before we go to a question from a listener, because we're going to have a slightly shorter live section of the podcast today. One thing is a listener, I'm so sorry I forgot your name, but you did write in a few days ago with a video, this is in the UK, taking your son down to going along a country lane in the UK and then realising that the Ukrainians were, I think, training on the Challenger 2s or training on some sort of tank in the field next to where they were. So they stopped and watched and waved and sort of wished them all the best. So thank you so much for sending us that video. It was quite instructive to see actually what does tank training look like. And secondly, Dom, just before we go to this listener's question, you described the Abrams as a big needy beast. Again, sort of dumb civilian question, but what do you mean? Do you mean in terms of fuel, ammunition? Is this? Can you take us into your army world there?
Yeah. So it's a different fuel system, different engine, and I mean it's a wonderfully capable weapon of war. But it has its own niche supply line. I mean, they all generally do. All weapon systems generally have their own supply line. There's very little commonality there is between variants. So the Leopard 2A4 to 2A6 to 2A7, of course, there's some commonality. But for example, between Challenger 1 and Challenger 2, there was only 40% commonality, and it's likely to be a similar figure between Challenger 2 and Challenger 3. So that introduces a whole host of difficulties if you've got different fuels, different oils, different lubricants, different spare parts. You've got different instruments and tooling to work on those spare parts. So the Abrams is a wonderful vehicle, but it was compared to sort of T-72, which is the vehicle, the tank that is in most widespread service in Ukraine at the moment, partly because of the ones they had and the ones that they were kindly gifted from Russia. I mean, the Abrams it's like it's landed from the moon. It's just a completely different order of vehicles. So, one of the reasons for the reluctance from the US to supply Abrams was because it's I shudder to say token force, because it's a 31 Abrams parked in your lawn is a problem for anybody. But they're going to be brilliant initially, and then they'll, as tanks do, they break down and need refurbing. They will be a much lower priority, I would imagine, because there just won't be the intricate and the niche logistic lines for those there, as there would be for T-72 variants and the Leopards that are going in. So yeah, if a blank piece of paper and an unlimited bag of cash, you'd go for Abrams over T-72. But if you then have to build the whole thing from scratch, it's being gifted the item is one thing, but being able to support it and fight it, not tomorrow, not next week, but in 6 months' time, I mean, that is a massive, massive undertaking. And to try and do that for a nature of equipment that's totally alien to every sort of logistic chain you have existing and you are likely to develop in the near future, then that's a big ask. So I would expect to see the Abrams once or twice, but not in routine service, I would venture. I think Leopard and T-72 is the name of the game there. I mean, Ukraine has about 500 T-72s that need refurbing, that have been damaged in the war so far or nicked from Russia, so on and so forth. So the answer, if you could do it tomorrow, the answer to President Zelensky's I need a tank division's worth of equipment is refurb the ones you got. But of course, you're talking huge warehousing, scaling, maintenance pits, trained personnel who can do this sort of thing. So it's very, very difficult. And actually, if your problem, so that's a problem for the medium and long term, but if your short-term problem is just give me some heavy metal right now, then saying, okay, well, in 8 months' time, I'll have refurbed 500 T-72s, that ain't the answer. So there's a whole load of things happening here. It's really inefficient to have these lots of different tanks going there. But actually, as we, the UK and others, saw through Iraq and Afghanistan, when we realised that we had the wrong kit, the kit we had wasn't ideal for the environment we were fighting in. You go through this process. We went through the process of what's called UOR, urgent operational requirement, when we just turn around to industry and we say, just sell us stuff. We need that. How much it costs? Right, fine. We'll have that. That's fine. It solves today's problem. But none of the kit talks to each other. They don't have the same radios. They don't have the same commonality. They don't work on the same fuel or what have you. So that problem is put off for a later day. When the wolf's at the door, you deal with the, I'm mixing my metaphors here, but you deal with the wolf closest to the sledge, basically. And all those questions about longer term sustainment, that has to necessarily be put off for another day. And the demand right now is just to get the heavy metal out there. So that's why Abrams has come into the fold. But as I said, I think that was just used to unlock the Leopards, or set the Leopards free, as they said.
Thanks, Dom. Let's zoom out from tanks just for one question from a listener. And I'm going to read this all out because I think the way they phrased it is quite interesting. And I think it'll give Dom, well, not me, but give Dom a chance to sort of expound on some of, maybe sort of colour in some of the aspects of the warfare we're seeing across the Donbass at the moment. So this is Josh writing in. He's saying, we hear about fronts, territory, advances, lines, and it's easy to draw these things in abstract on a map with some squiggly lines and arrows. But practically speaking, these represent real people and equipment on the ground. How spread out are these? Presumably towns and their immediate surroundings have the heaviest concentration of troops and the roads connecting these towns, but what about the space between the towns and the roads? Take two towns 20 kilometres apart. Is there 20-kilometre line of trenches or outposts or emplacements between them? Or are there gaps? Are there blind spots? Does the real front line extend as far as humans there can see and shoot? Is it a line we can trace on a map, or is it just much more nebulous? I realise he's asking a lot of questions there, but Dom, I wondered if you could give your sense of to our listeners of what we think the front line looks like, if you were to sort of give us a sort of mind's eye tour.
Yeah, okay. Josh, thanks for the question. And the very small and simple answer is yes, it's all of the things you've described there, but not in all of the places all of the time. So if we think about the First World War, the classic line of trenches stretching from the Atlantic coast down to the sort of Swiss border, I mean, that is happening in some areas. There are trenches, holes in the ground, with men and women living there for weeks at a time, being resupplied, fighting from those trenches, living and dying in those trenches. That is happening in some areas, not everywhere across the front. The Second World War, the Normandy landings, the bocage, the area just to the south of the Normandy landings, where the US, Brits, Canadians and the Allies got absolutely, well, we were held up for a long time because the nature of the ground there was very difficult for tanks. A lot of small, this is in the bocage in northern France, a lot of small hamlets and villages that were all within a kilometre, a couple of kilometres to each other, which is the weapon range of the anti-tank weapons the Germans had at the time. So they were able to very easily put down a lattice work of anti-tank areas that they could deny to the Allies without having to use trenches. So it was very, very difficult to move around in that area and try and take those small villages without getting whacked by German anti-tank rounds. But there weren't trenches as we commonly expected them or understood them to be from the First World War. So it's a mixture of all that. The ground will dictate how best to defend it and how best to attack it. So if you've got a large open area, you don't necessarily need to dig a big trench. You just need a few radars that can look out over that and can spot any movement. Now, if you spot movement, you've got to then have something to make sure, well, is that a civilian vehicle? Is it a tank? Is it a person walking with a gun? Is it a deer? Yeah, all the rest of it. So you have to cover all these areas by observation. You also have to cover them by fire. There's absolutely no point at all in defending an area to your front or to the flanks, covering it in view so you can see there, or either with your Mark 1 eyeball or radar or something like that, or a drone, what have you. But if you can't bring fire down to bear there, if you see a tank, an enemy tank column moving through there, and you can't do anything about it, then that is not a well constructed defence. So it depends on the ground and what is available to you, where you can put your weapons, in this case, in that example, artillery, for example, where you put your artillery that can cover that gap. Now, if you can't cover everywhere on the front, then you might need to bring your lines back a bit. You might need to withdraw to an area that you've got some artillery 10, 15 Ks behind you that can cover your gaps, as well as cover the gaps to your south and the gaps to your north in Matey Boy's sector. But so you might have to move your lines, and the front line will settle down into what is the art of the possible, dictated by the ground and dictated by your weapons and the coverage they can provide. So yes, in certain areas there will be physical trenches. In other areas there will be a bit of the sort of lattice work of the bocage type anti-tank network, and in other areas that the ground, the front line might, for reasons that if you look at it from a map make no sense whatsoever, but suddenly go backwards. That might be because that's all that can be covered by what few long-range artillery units you have. And as you move your assets around, if you want your long-range artillery to move from the north down to the south to cover another front down there, then that might mean that the other troops in the north might have to move back a bit or adjust their positions if they are no longer covered by this umbrella of indirect fire. So there's a whole number of reasons why the front lines are where they are, why they move seemingly without any enemy interference whatsoever, and what is possible. And the skill of a military commander is to look at a piece of ground and see it in defensive and offensive terms. So how are you going to assault that position? And then once you've assaulted it, how are you going to hold it? There's absolutely no point at all in breaking through the enemy lines, as we saw up in Kharkiv last autumn. When the Ukrainians broke through, they went about 60 or 70 Ks and were held on the line of the river. Name escapes me of the river, but that was a natural defensive barrier. They could have carried on, probably. They might have been running out of fuel by then, but they could have replaned and carried on. But they might have overextended themselves, because once you push too far, then you yourself are vulnerable from your flanks and you're in danger of being cut off and all the rest of it. So a military commander will look at a piece of ground and see what I can do with it, how far should I go, maybe I need to go backwards. Maybe I need to be a bit more defensive here because I'm a bit vulnerable, or I can't provide adequate support to my neighbouring units north and south if I'm in this position. So there's all these considerations going on the whole time, and then of course the enemy gets a vote and they do the thing that you really haven't expected, or you haven't planned for, or you've considered but you thought they'd be mad to do that. Well, guess what? They're mad. So they go and do something and catch you off guard, and so it's always moving, and you've always got to take into consideration these variables which change by time, they change with weather, they change with political appetite, they change with military appetite for risk. So it's a constant melange of wrong answers, and I think the idea is to be the least badly wrong in terms of a military commander.
Earlier this week, Associate Editor Dominic Nicholls and our Defence Editor Danny Sheridan had a conversation with Labour MP John Healy. Mr Healy is Labour's Shadow Secretary for Defence, and, in the event of a general election, if Labour won, would become the new Defence Secretary. Understanding his party's view on the Ukraine war is of huge importance. Here is their conversation.
We're very lucky now to be joined by John Healy, Shadow Secretary of State for Defence. Mr Healy, welcome to The Telegraph, welcome to the podcast, great to have you here.
Hello, thank you very much.
First of all, how's the defence brief? What does it look like to you? Why were you attracted to that desk, or were you just parachuted in?
No, it's big. It couldn't be more important, especially at this time. And it is fundamental to the duty of any government to keep the country safe, protect its citizens. And I recognise that. Keir Starmer recognises that, both having served in government. And we're determined to give people the confidence that when we come to an election, if they want a change of government, they would have in Labour a government that is strong enough, determined enough to do what's required to keep the country safe.
It's too glib to ask you, is defence safe in Labour's hands? But what do you detect from the British public? When will you know that you are beyond that question? How will you know that you're...
I take a lot of encouragement from the fact that over 500 of the new members that joined the Labour Party immediately after the conference in the autumn over those couple of months were from the forces. I take great comfort of the fact that people recognise now that Labour is a party that respects the armed forces and speaks up for them. We've been helping give voice to the concerns that many forces and forces families have about the quality of housing and accommodation, which has been a long-run sore that should have been fixed and hasn't over the last decade and more. So I take great comfort from that, and I draw the contrast with a really tough 2019 election when some of the hardest doors to knock on were those with Help for Hero stickers in the windows or British Legion stickers. That's changed. But we have to demonstrate and earn that confidence and trust for the future. And, one of the reasons that I was out last weekend at the big international Munich Security Conference, and Labour hadn't been there since the time when we were last in government, was to say, look, our Labour commitment to UK national security, to NATO itself, and to standing with Ukraine is totally unshakable. And Keir Starmer gave the same message directly to President Zelensky last week when he was in Kyiv.
Now, we are due an election by January 25, very unlikely to have one in that month or in the run up to Christmas. So we're probably looking at autumn-ish next year. So the starting gun's going to, we've got probably, a year or so until we're into it hard. So the prospect of you being in power and leading the Ukraine policy is very real. So could I ask you, there seems to be a divergent view at the moment in Europe about Russia. Some broadly the sort of French lead suggesting that we need to factor in a post-war Russia into the security architecture that we're talking about today. Others, Central and Eastern Europe, seem to be, look, Russia after the war is an irrelevance. We just build our own defence, we concentrate on ourselves, and then we just deal with whatever Russia is left. But trying to factor it in now gives them too much power and could be too murky for trying to set policy. I mean, where are you on that sort of that balance?
Well, you're right. That is a very live debate. I take a couple of points of reflection from where things stand now. And in contrast to many who, perhaps driven by wishful thinking, believe that somehow the Ukraine conflict's going to be over in the next few months, I think it's clear to me that the next government, after the next election, whenever that is, will inherit the Ukraine conflict and will inherit that wider Russian aggression for the long term. The second is that one of the things that Keir Starmer and I have stressed repeatedly, and we said it to the Ukrainian ambassador when he made an historic address to the Parliamentary Labour Party last night, is that there may be a change of government at the next election, but there will be no change in Britain's resolve to confront Russian aggression, to pursue Putin for his war crimes, and to stand with Ukraine. And that was a message that Keir Starmer gave to President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people directly last week when he was in Kyiv.
There does seem to be quite a lot of cross-party cooperation. Not coordination's too strong, but cooperation at the moment. I understand Secretary of State briefs you regularly or includes you regularly in briefings. It seems as if there is a coherent sort of British response here. I mean, is that, how helpful is that? Are you able to put down markers with your opposite numbers over in the States and across Europe, across the rest of the world, or how much preparation are you able to do before any potential movement into power?
Well, first of all, you're right. The steps the government has taken to provide military assistance to Ukraine and to reinforce our NATO allies, that they have had the fullest Labour support from the outset. And this time last year, just before the invasion, David Lammy and I were in Kyiv. We spoke to one of the former prime ministers of Ukraine who said Western unity is Ukraine's best defence, and we were able to say then that there will be total unity in the UK in the face of any Russian aggression. And because we recognise that Putin is not just concerned with Ukraine, this is an attempt to redraw international boundaries by force. It rides roughshod over fundamental UN Charter obligations to respect sovereignty and territorial integrity. In fact, the very obligations that Putin himself and Russia have signed up to in treaties with Ukraine. So we knew that this was not just a fight that Ukraine is mounting to repel this Russian invasion, but this is an attempt to stand up for the same democratic values, a sense of international rules and order, and it matters. And it matters because Putin won't stop at Ukraine. And in terms of what happens next, our full efforts must be to give Ukraine the support and to equip them to drive the Russians back, resist the mounting Russian aggression, and then drive them back when they judge the time's right, perhaps in the spring and the summer.
Last one in Ukraine for me, if I may. The Russian land army has been broken in Ukraine. Still got a very credible air force, air and missile force, very credible navy, especially the subsurface fleet. But the land army has been broken, land army being one of the biggest military threats to this country since the Second World War. Is there an opportunity now for Britain to take a 10-year, not capability holiday, but get rid of the Challenger, do something with Ajax, but say, sorry, NATO, we're not there for the next few years, but in 10 years' time, we will be absolutely back on top. Because Challenger 3 would be fantastic today. In 10 years' time, when it's due to come in, it will be pretty good. So is there an opportunity now to say, let's take some risks, the first opportunity after the Second World War, or are you just going to keep with the baked-in, the silted-up equipment programme in the MOD?
No, I think the problem in the last 10 years has been that holiday has been taken and has been exposed by the Ukrainian invasion. I see Russia as far from a spent force. You're quite right about its air force, its nuclear capability, and its navy and submarine fleet. If you talk to the Baltic nations, or the Poles as I do, they believe that Russia has the capability of regrouping its defence industries on 24-hour production. That isn't just to try and support the invasion of Ukraine, but it's clearly to replace their kit and their stockpiles. And even the Russian army will learn from this. So the idea that somehow the Russian army is broken, it's a spent force, we don't need to worry about it for a decade, I think is to take exactly the wrong lesson from this. And that's why I think the NATO plans over the next decade the 300,000 strong high readiness force, the determination to return to a sense of deterrence and defence on its borders, I think is so important. And I want to see Britain secure as the leading European nation in NATO. I believe post-Ukraine, the NATO nations in Europe need to do more of the heavy lifting within NATO. So for me, the future over the next 10 years, Britain's commitment and strategy has got to be NATO first. We've got to fulfil our obligations to NATO in full. And there are growing questions, whether it's over our ability to field a full fighting division, the cuts in our sort of wedge-tail surveillance planes, or indeed at times when the threats are clearly increasing and NATO is stepping up its force readiness, we're still pursuing plans to cut the British Army by another 10,000 troops. Now, that makes no sense to me. I think those are the wrong calls. And what I really want to see in next month's new integrated review and spring budget is the government getting to grips with the big decisions that are required to keep Britain safe for the future, but also for Britain to continue to play the leading role and discharge our obligations in NATO.
So it sounds like you are open to a conversation about cutting the army by another 10,000 down to, 72,500, I think that's 72,500-ish. What about the reserves? Reserves are supposed to be 30,000 people ready, sat on their Bergens, can get out the door tomorrow. That's utterly fanciful, and we all know that. So when the government says, the British Army is 105,000, we know it's rubbish. So if you're open to a discussion on the 10,000, are you also open to a discussion about the reserves, and actually are they worth the poster? And I know they're very good people. I've served with them in Iraq and elsewhere. I'm not having a go at the people. I suggest the government policy of saying, yes, these 30,000 are good to go is wrong and needs addressing.
I see reserves as a vital part of the picture of our armed forces, but it's the full-time forces that count most. I'm not open to a discussion about the cuts to 10,000, and for more than a year I've been arguing that the government's plans in the face of increasing threats, identified nearly 2 years ago, of course, by the integrated review at that time, must be halted so that there can be a rethink over the approach that we take. And
you would halt that decision to cut 10,000?
Yes, and we've Keir Starmer's called for that. I've called for that. We've been doing that for well over a year. It just is. It runs contrary to the government's observation, quite rightly, that the threats are increasing and diversifying that the Britain faces, and at a time now, post-Ukraine or post-Ukrainian invasion, when NATO is stepping up its capabilities and its readiness and reinforcing its defensive lines, then Britain appears to be going in exactly the opposite direction. And you have to say, look, 25 other NATO nations have, since the invasion nearly a year ago, rebooted their defence plans, rebooted their defence budgets. Britain's done neither. It has the opportunity next month in the new integrated review and the spring budget to do both. And that's going to be a big test of this government. Is it capable of making those decisions that will secure our future and our future security as a nation and our role in NATO? Or is it too concerned with the week-to-week survival to face up to those big decisions, and it fudges both?
Last one for me. In terms of defence philosophy, how much of the defence budget do you think should be a spend in Britain type pool for equipment and all that leads to in the British sort of economy? For example, I mean, fleet solid support ships. I'm going to get the numbers all wrong, but for the money available, if we could get 3 from South Korea,
1.6 billion.
Thank you. That's why you're sat over there. But if it's 3 or 4 from South Korea, 2 building in the UK. So in terms of value for money for the taxpayer, that might be better in the UK. But in terms of the combat capability that it gives to the military, for many things, it's better to go overseas. Where do you see the MOD budget?
Yeah, my first principle and Labour's commitment will be to direct British taxpayers' money first to British companies and British jobs. First, that reinforces our UK economy, but secondly, it strengthens our UK sovereignty. And it makes no sense to me to be blind to the benefits to Britain of investment in the UK. Some projects are clearly complex, big, require that sort of international collaboration. There will be occasions when the best of what we need is not made, can't be made in Britain, but there should be a higher bar for buying abroad. And for too long, we've had competition is king, price overrules everything. And the Fleet Solid support ships, the 3 support ships to our British Navy, which were first announced more than 6 years ago, really could and should be built fully in Britain. It's a huge, wasted, missed opportunity.
Even if it means fewer hulls?
That
might be a bad example because we're only dealing with 3, but generally if buying in Britain means a lower quantity of the thing you're trying to buy, you'd still be content.
Do you know one of the tough things about doing the defence job in opposition is that you simply don't have access to the classified and commercial information that allows you to make those calls. But we had a 100% British consortium bidding for the contract. They knew the price. They knew what was required. There is no reason why those 3 ships shouldn't now be built fully in Britain, in UK yards, by British labour, bringing the benefits to our economy, but also the reinforced strength of our own industry to provide for ourselves in a really critical area and capability. And if Labour had been in government, we would have made that decision. We'd be building them in Britain.
Can I ask you that question again in 18 months if you happen to be in power?
You certainly can.
Thank you.
By that time, I'll have had a look at the contract and whether there's any review. I'll have a look at the contract and what ministers are blithely saying now will be 60% plus of the ship, all 3 ships built in Britain, whether there is any legal and contractual requirement for that work share to be in Britain. We have none of that information. They've stonewalled any attempts by the Defence Select Committee to get that basic information. So I feel very strongly that this is selling the pass on Britain and failing the basic test of public accountability.
Okay. Interesting philosophy. Thank you.
Thanks for coming in, John. So it's Danielle, Sheridan, Defence Editor at The Telegraph. You and I were both at the Munich Security Conference. A big theme was fighter jets, sending fighter jets to Ukraine now. If you were in government, where do you stand on that?
Yeah, the discussion about fighter jets, it's clear the Ukrainians really want the F-16s. We don't have F-16s. And for me, the whole approach of the allied nations like Britain supporting Ukraine is about the coordination and each country doing as much as it can. So we don't have the jets they want, but we've rightly offered to train fast jet combat pilots. So that's Britain making a significant contribution now, and I understand why the Defence Secretary, who is certainly having a look at it, as we're told, is saying in public, look, it'll be months, if not years, before Britain may be in a position to consider actually giving jets to Ukraine. So that's where I'm happy to sit alongside him on that. What I don't want is the debate about jets to distract from the immediate urgent need that Ukraine has for trained fighters and the kit that and the weapon systems they need to be able to push the Russians back in a spring or early summer offensive. And that's where I think the debate, it's where the public interest should lie, and that's what I'd want to see the government giving most attention.
But when you've got the president of Ukraine literally pleading with our government to provide wings, how can you not have that as the main point of discussion?
Because he needs the weapon systems, he needs the support, he needs the trained troops in the next few months to be able to push the Russians back when the weather allows him to do that and when they're ready. The fighter jets is a medium to long-term challenge. We can contribute, we can continue to play a leading role in coordinating the contributions of others, just as we have as part of the response to this crisis from Britain. That's what we should be concentrating on.
Do you fear such a move would be antagonistic or escalatory towards the Russians?
I think the important one feature of the Western unity and the Western coordination has been, I think at each step, there has been a reasonable calculation of the consequences and the potential escalation. And I think the Western allies have actually factored that intelligently into the support that we've been able to give to Ukraine. The risk of escalation, of course, and the responsibility for any escalation will lie with Putin. But it's important now we give Ukraine everything they need to defend and take back the territory that Russia has brutally and illegally seized since the 24th of February last year.
So we have a spring budget coming up. There's apparently a row between the Treasury and the MOD over whether or not they're going to get an increase in defence spending in line with inflation. I suspect, in fact, I have written that you are of the thinking that we should be increasing defence spending. But as a Labour Party of the working person, how does one square putting a load of more money into the defence budget when NHS workers can't even get a pay rise?
The financial situation Britain faces now is really serious, and it's made worse because the current government in the autumn crashed the economy, sent inflation soaring, and the pound plummeting. So that has squeezed defence budgets even more fiercely as threats are increasing. These are the really tough decisions any government will face and does face. And I'd simply say, really, Labour will always spend what's required on defence. What's required is what is based on the assessment of the threats that you face. Just as a reminder to some of your listeners, of course, in Labour's last year in government in 2010, Britain was spending 2.5% of our GDP, our gross national income, on defence. Now, that's a level that's never been close to being matched in any of the 13 years since. And currently, Britain is bumping along at about 2.1% of GDP, just above that NATO target level.
Does it concern you when you read that Estonia is going to push their defence spending up to 3%? Poland's announced it's going to double it to 4% of GDP. These are much smaller nations than us. Does it concern you that we are not along that trajectory?
Estonia this year is playing a remarkable role for a small country. More than 1% of its entire GDP is this year being given in military aid to Ukraine. It's not just Estonia and Poland, it's Latvia and Lithuania, for instance, all of whom will be spending this year 3% of their GDP on defence. And we've seen really big commitments, historic commitments and shifts in Germany, and big commitments also from President Macron of France. It's part of this picture which I mentioned earlier, 25 NATO nations in the last year since Putin invaded Ukraine have already rebooted their defence planning and their defence spending. We're yet to do either. And whilst the crisis response that Britain has made to the Ukraine invasion has been strong and sound, there is a void in government vision about what next. And there has been a strategic inertia within government and ministers over being able to rethink international and domestic defence and security planning, and that's what's required in the new integrated review next month alongside the spring budget.
So my last question then, nicely taken into the integrated review refresh. You believe it was wrong to slash troops by 10,000. Would you like to see that reversed? And if so, to what figure would you, a Labour government, be happy with? How many troops would be a sustainable, not even sustainable, a solid figure for the British Armed Forces?
I don't think you can fix those figures in opposition. You can't fix those figures without knowing what the threats are, what the state of our own forces are, what the capabilities of potential enemies and adversaries are. There were some strengths in the government's last integrated review. We're right to aim to be a science and technology superpower by 2030. They were right to identify Russia as the most acute threat, but the sort of gung-ho, go-it-alone Britain in the world tilt towards the Indo-Pacific distracted us from that. We're failing to meet some of our NATO obligations. So I want to see in the new integrated review, first of all, a very clear recommitment to NATO first and fulfilling our obligations in full. And if Labour got into power, we'd do a NATO test in our first 100 days. When Boris Johnson took defence and security off the negotiating table in the Brexit negotiation, the government has now left a Europe-shaped hole in our security strategy. So we've got to rebuild relationships with the European Union, greater cooperation on defence and security, possibly a formal pact. We've certainly got to rebuild relationships with some important ally nations like Germany and France. And finally, on the troop numbers, the third big flaw for me in the integrated review was the mismatch between the ambitions in the integrated review, and then the defence plans in the defence white paper. So a boast that Britain would pursue persistent global engagement in the integrated review was set alongside a defence plan which sees a cut of 10,000 full-time troops in the army, a scrapping entirely of the Hercules planes, and a dropping down of the Challenger tanks to 148. Now, these are the troops that are reinforcing our NATO allies on the border of Russia. These are the planes that led the airlift out of Kabul, and
C-17.
These are the tanks that we're donating to Ukraine. So that mismatch and those flaws in defence planning need to be fixed.
But you didn't answer my question about how many troops would you...
Yeah, no, I did. At the very outset...
Give me a figure.
No, at the very outset, I said to you, in opposition, we don't have access to any of the information to make those detailed judgments. You can't fix a firm figure. Frustrating as it is to you, it's frustrating as it is to me too.
Understood.
I know you've got to dash off, but I can't let it lie. What's the NATO test? Or have you just answered it there, saying we're going down to too few tanks, and the Indo-Pacific seems to be an indulgence that we can ill afford?
No, the NATO test is a review of the major programmes within the first 100 days to satisfy ourselves or find out the extent of the shortfall that our commitments to NATO entail. So are they meeting, are we set to meet what we've promised? Are the capabilities that we're looking to provide to NATO going to mean a real increase in the defence and security capacity of NATO?
But you've said the government already are failing in some areas of NATO, so you're anticipating there'll be holes in this NATO test, so you're already setting yourself up for increased capital spend.
I'm reflecting the sort of doubts and questions that everyone from US generals to some of our own forces and allied nations are voicing. So I know that we're not fully meeting our obligations. We're set to fall short. If Labour got into government, I want to know what the nature and extent of that shortfall is, where the capability gaps are, where the finance gaps are, where perhaps we are committed to capabilities that aren't producing the reinforced defence for the period ahead that perhaps NATO needs. So that's why I'm saying we need a NATO test. It needs to be done immediately as a 100-day priority, because we can see and we hear from others the concerns that are being raised.
One to pick up later if you
indeed
get into power. John Healy, Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Claire Hubble.